the early 1950s, God brought together 5 men and their families to the jungles of Ecuador. 5 men whose lives would go on to touch the world. Their names were Jim Elliot, Nate Saint, Roger Yadarian, Pete Fleming, and Ed McCulley. Each of these men were capable, very capable by the world's standards. Yet each had an overwhelming desire to leave their homes in America and to go to the jungles of Ecuador to reach the indigenous people there with the gospel of Christ. This missionary zeal was met with great opposition from family and even godly people in their own lives. Some would say, why would you go on to waste your life in the jungles of Ecuador when you could make such a difference here in America? To these responses, one of these young men replied in his journal, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." That man's name was Jim Elliot. After spending several years ministering to different tribes in the rainforests of Ecuador, God finally brought these men together through a desire to reach the Auca Indians. The Auca Indians were a fierce warrior-like tribe in the area who no one had ever really reached and lived to tell about it. Yet it was their overwhelming burden to take the gospel, no matter how dangerous, no matter how fierce these people may be, to take the gospel to a people who had never heard, so that they could hear of the love of Christ. Out of a desire to make a relationship with the Aucas, they figured out a way that they could drop off gifts by plane without going down and visiting them in person. After finding a safe place along the riverbank to land the plane, they finally felt it was time to make an in-person contact with the Auca Indians. On January 6, 1956, that contact would finally come, as 3 Auca Indians came out of the jungle and greeted the 5 missionaries. This experience went greater than they had expected, and they even allowed one of the Auca Indians to get into the plane with them, and they flew over the tribe. As they returned back in the plane, the missionaries rejoiced. They thought this was what they had been praying for. And as the Auca Indians went away, the missionaries prayed with great anticipation that God would bring back a larger group, and this would be the open door to reach the Aucas with the gospel. After much praying, that second visit with the Auca Indians would finally come. On January the 8th, 1956, a group of Auca men appeared out of the jungle. However, rather than greeting the missionaries with open arms and welcoming them to their village, they rather greeted them with spears. The men would go on to spear the missionaries to death right there on that beach. Days later, a search party would come and find the missionaries' bodies, and they would bury them right on the beach where they had first made contact with the Auca Indians. And some people would be tempted to think, was that not a waste? What happened next? I submit to you today, it wasn't a waste. Those men gave their lives so the Aucas could hear the gospel. And months later, God would touch the hearts of some of the wives of those very missionaries. And they would go back and live amongst the tribe who had killed their fathers and their husbands, and be used by God to win the Aucas to Christ. Today, the Auca Indians are not the fierce warrior-like tribe that they once were. Today, many of them have come to know the Lord and Savior. And you say, why? I think it's because a few men were willing to give what they could not keep to gain what they could not lose.